Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roxana-Maria Arăş, and I am a faculty fellow at the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first session of Archives and Dialogue. This is a new webinar series organized by the Center, which explores the intersections of archives, community engagement, and knowledge production across the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and the United States. I'm thrilled to be joined today by three great scholars and practitioners whom I admire very much, whose work sits at the intersection of archives, public scholarship, and community engagement. Before I introduce them, let me briefly set the context for the broad Archives and Dialogue project and for our webinar, our conversation today. So Archives and Dialogue aspires to be, and it is, a public digital humanities initiative connecting institutional and grassroots archives across the Middle East, North Africa, and the United States. This webinar series brings together archivists, scholars, and cultural practitioners to explore the ethical and methodological challenges of documenting alternative histories of the MENA region and its diasporas. At its core, the project fosters cross-regional exchanges around key issues, including collecting materials from the MENA region, innovative archival methods, and navigating institutional constraints. Each webinar centers on a specific theme. Today, we focus on Arab American histories, examining how archival practices shape narratives about migration and urban imaginaries in New York and Michigan. Drawing on collections from the New York Public Library and the Arab American National Museum, our speakers explore how storytelling and preservation can transform archiving into activism that can disrupt dominant narratives. Also, by situating discussions within the urban context of two cities that we all love, New York and Michigan, they examine how diasporic memory and archival practice shape the cultural and spatial fabric of the city. Now, before we begin, I want to note that the Kevorkian Center at NYU has exciting programming planned for the semester, and our wonderful graduate assistants, Miriam and Zainab, will share links in the chat for upcoming events. So please keep an eye on the chat. I also want to acknowledge and thank the partners and sponsors who have made this webinar possible. So the webinar series is co-sponsored by the NYU Program in Museum Studies, and we are honored to partner with the New York Public Library, the Arab American National Museum, and the Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies, whose collections and expertise are at the heart of today's conversation. And now briefly, let me introduce our wonderful speakers. First, we have Curator Elizabeth Barrett-Sullivan, who is the Curator of Collections at the Arab American National Museum in Michigan. In her roles at the museum, she has led and executed the creation of over 60 temporary exhibitions, including curation and research. Elizabeth brings deep expertise in curating collections that center Arab American experiences and has been instrumental in building community-based archives. Next, we're joining by Hiba Abid, who oversees collections of materials from the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, and diasporic communities as curator for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the New York Public Library. Before joining the library, she taught courses on Islamic manuscripts and material culture at NYU and the Louvre Museum. And finally, we have Akram Khater, a professor of history and the director of the Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at North Carolina State University. Akram's research and curatorial work examines how diasporic memory and archival practices intersect to reshape our understanding about migration, belonging, and community formation. Together, these three speakers bring invaluable, as far as I'm concerned, invaluable perspectives from two major hubs of Arab American life, New York and Michigan. And their work exemplifies the kind of collaborative community-centered archival practice that Archives and Dialogue seeks to promote. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to briefly say why this conversation matters, not just for Arab American communities, but for all of us thinking about archives, memory, and justice. Archives are political. They determine whose stories are preserved and whose are forgotten. But archives can do more than preserve. They can activate, reconnect, and transform across regions. When done collaboratively, archival work helps communities tell their own stories and imagine new futures. That's what Archives and Dialogue is about. creating spaces where archives become sites of conversation, creativity, and collaboration. So with this framing in mind, I'm thrilled to turn things over to our speakers. We'll begin with Elizabeth, then we'll continue with Hiba, and at the end, we will have the respondent intervention of Akram. After they share their reflections, we'll move into dialogue between the three of them, and then open things up for questions. Because we are a large number of participants, we have decided that questions will be addressed in the chat box, and then our graduate assistants will synthesize the questions and send them to me, and I will pose the questions on your behalf. Thank you all for being here today. This is the first of many conversations in the webinar series, and we are excited to build a community of practice with you. And as a reminder, the webinar is recorded and it will be advertised by our center. With this in mind, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me just bring up my presentation. There we go. All right. Hello, thank you so much for having me as part of the discussion today representing the A&M. I'm going to start by giving a brief history of the founding of our institution to help introduce how we have developed and adapted our collections over the past, actually more than 20 years. The A&M opened on May 5th, 2005 in the heart of East Dearborn in the beautiful building in the background of my slide. A&M is a program of our parent organization, Access, which was the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services. It was founded in Dearborn's South End in 1971. Focusing first on housing, immigration, food assistance, and healthcare, Access was a creation of Arab American social activists who were fighting against the city of Dearborn's racist attempts to invoke eminent domain and push the mostly immigrant community out of the South End. The South End has been a significant industrial center for the automobile industry since 1917, with a surrounding low-income and largely immigrant community who work in the nearby factories and refineries. You can see in the lower right image the Dix Road Mosque with the Ford Rouge plant billowing smoke in the background. Access's early main office is seen in the background of the top right image. The mural on the side depicted not only the community's diversity, but also its tenacity to not be divided. Access is still a lifeline for many immigrants and refugees who are coming from occupied Palestine, Lebanon, and Yemen. Language lessons, legal assistance, job finding, and other community programs helped with acclimation and success for many. Access continued to evaluate the needs of the growing community in the late 1980s, and the Cultural Arts Department was established there. The goal was to provide programming to help parents practice and teach their children traditional arts and history from their homelands. By the late 90s, Access and other community leaders agreed that, much like the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles and the many African American museums throughout the country, the Arab American community should have its own museum and bring Arab American culture into the mainstream. Much debate about our location and scope was had for several years, and the final decision was to stay in Dearborn among the community that was building it. The top left picture is the old furniture store on Michigan Avenue that was eventually purchased in 2003. And the lower left is the Access director, Ismail Ahmed, at the time at the groundbreaking ceremony that September. The store was completely torn down in order to build the museum anew. However, the iconic shape was mimicked as a nod to what once stood there for decades. The Cultural Arts Department and its more than a decade of programs created the base for the museum's collections. The displays at Access's main office covered the history and diversity of the Arab world, as well as stories from the Dearborn community, personal artifacts from everyday people working in municipal services, politics, and the automobile industry. And early Arab American-owned restaurants, stores, and other businesses were highlighted alongside religious and arts traditions maintained in the new homeland. In the early 2000s, Access staff and the museum's founding team traveled the country, reaching out and creating a network of Arab American community-based organizations to help in the gathering of more stories and artifacts to fill what became the museum. They connected with Arab American scholars who had been building their own personal archives and scholarship for decades, and A&M became a place that those materials could be preserved instead of just being absorbed into university collections. This was not an easy task. A lot of work went into establishing trust in these communities. Many individuals were reluctant to part with items that were their rare connections to homes they left or family members who were no longer living. We had to sometimes make do with replicas or nothing physical at all. Other folks were reluctant to be highlighted for fear of political ramifications. The focus on national collecting and storytelling helped to open up the museum's mission and scope to encompass a much larger and nuanced story of who Arab Americans are. Our founding mission statement was, the Arab American National Museum documents, preserves, celebrates, and educates the public on the history, life, culture, and contributions of Arab Americans. It serves as a resource to enhance the knowledge and understanding of Arab Americans and their presence in the United States. We have the great privilege and also responsibility to document this community in multidimensional ways. We aren't just focusing on the Lebanese and Syrian Christians who migrated in larger numbers at the turn of the 20th century. We're also documenting those who came in the minority then and now and in between. We are documenting the community as it changes and adapts to life in the US, and we are documenting it through more than just one medium. We hold personal papers, photographs, periodicals, artwork, textiles, kitchen utensils, and their own voices and words when we can get it. The core exhibitions, which snippets of which you can see on the top right and bottom left, focus little on the history of the Arab world and instead on the history of Arab Americans as individuals and as community builders. This was largely for the benefit of an outside audience, especially after the events of September 11th, when misinformation, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab bias in general was rampant. But we are also aiming to be a gathering space for the community, to celebrate and organize and feel like they belong with no caveats. The exhibition shown in the top center was called Patriots and Peacemakers, which traveled the country from 2011 until 2015. It was our first large traveling exhibition. It told the stories of over 100 Arab Americans who served in the US military, as well as a few dozen Arab Americans who were members of the Peace Corps or diplomatic services. We were aiming to get the stories of Arab Americans in front of eyes of folks who would likely never come to Dearborn. We were hosted at universities, libraries, and even the Capitol building. We were able to engage or re-engage the local Arab American communities in many of these host cities, strengthening our presence and impact. We have also slowly been growing our international impact in the last decade. We have hosted some exchange programs where kids here in Michigan can connect to those in Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine for various projects. We have loaned objects for exhibitions in Egypt and Qatar and been printed in numerous publications. I recount all of these accomplishments because when we talk about the growth of an institution, I want us to be thinking about more than just the physical stuff and the space that we take up on a piece of land in Dearborn, and more about the impact that we are having within and externally from our community. In our digital age, our online collections databases are a gateway to learning about what we have in our collection and who we are as an institution. I love to talk to other museum professionals about the inadequacies of databases available to us, but I'm actually quite proud of what we're able to share. On the right is the online portal for the database system that we have been using since our founding. It's called Past Perfect. It's an out-of-the-box software that is meant to serve many types of collecting institutions. It serves us because, as I said, we don't deal in only one type of artifact or archive. We deal with it all. The majority of our collections can be found through this online portal, which is amazing because many institutions are only making very little of their collections searchable online, and we're aiming to get all of it out there. However, our database is only as good as the information you put into it, so small improvements are happening constantly for us in terms of subject tagging and biographical information that we can add. About 10 years ago, we recognized the desire to make digital material even more accessible to researchers. So we looked at a lot of different options and ultimately decided to supplement with a service from the OCLC called Content DM. It allows us to upload playable videos and audio clips, as well as full text and OCR books and documents that are also fully downloadable. We've established this as a base for our special collections, like our growing oral history collection, as well as from scholars and folks like Evelyn Shacker and Alexa Knapp. We've also experimented with online exhibitions, like for the Pen League, showing off some rare books and objects. So growing larger in size is not necessarily sustainable or a stated goal of ours. Even digital spaces have their limits. Instead, we are continuing to contribute to strengthening Arab American scholarship throughout the country through preservation workshops, through various collaborations, through site visits. Our new mission statement is that we are a touchstone that connects communities to Arab American culture and experiences. We do not need to be the only place that holds this knowledge. And in fact, we are thrilled to have such wonderful colleagues in arms and my fellow panelists. I know Akram's on a quest for more Arabic language support and translation in our collections, and I hope that we can find ways to support that. I've had the privilege of watching our field grow for the last 2 decades, and I can't wait to see what we accomplish together in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Don't forget that you can write your questions in the chat box, okay? And now I'm gonna hand it to Hiba, and the floor is yours, Hiba.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your very inspiring talk and work of the Arab American National Museum. And thank you for inviting me. I will try to make it very tight and short. And I will use the exhibition that I curated at the New York Public Library to frame the conversation today. So very briefly, New York, Middle East, and North African Lives in the City is an exhibition that opened at the New York Public Library, the flagship building by Bryant Park, on October 4th and is running through March 8th. The exhibition traces the history of Middle East and North African immigration to New York City from the first waves in the 1880s to the present. So we all know, and Elizabeth just mentioned this, and including in New York, this history has been overlooked or flattened into a handful of stereotypes, and yet MENA communities have shaped the city for well over a century, culturally, artistically, economically, and intellectually. So the exhibition really highlights that dual relationship. It shows how immigrants, artists, writers from the Middle East and North Africa shaped New York City, and how New York in turn shaped their lives, identities, and creative practices. And so something that I want to emphasize is that rather than a top-down historical narrative, it centers personal histories and everyday experiences, the kinds of stories that most public narratives have tended to sideline. So visitors, when they come, they shouldn't expect to, to be exposed to the grand narrative of MENA immigration to New York City. And the exhibition also approaches this history through the lens of the New York Public Library's MENA Diaspora Collections that were formed since the late 19th century. And many people just discovered this by coming to the exhibition or learning about the exhibition. So in that sense, the exhibition is also a reflection on the library itself, how history is documented, how voices are preserved, and what it means for institutions to evolve and build on the legacy of the past. And in fact, many of the angles that I chose to address in the show came directly from community expectations. The need to rethink collecting practices, to address archival silences, and to build a future that is ever more inclusive, not just in content, but also in interpretation. Showing a few images here, and for those who won't be able to visit New York in the next few months, this is what the exhibition, the gallery looks like, and the beautiful graphic design is the work of Lebanese graphic designer Wael Morgos. I won't be able, I think, to talk more about the graphic design, but I'm happy to keep this for the conversation later. And what you see on the arch is New York, so the title of the show, which is taken from, the way New York appears in many of the Arabic and other Middle Eastern language materials that I came across as I was researching in our collections for the show. And it foregrounds a view from within the communities themselves rather than the gaze typically applied from the outside. Very briefly here, some words on the fonts that were used that refer to archival catalog card catalog, sorry, for the Middle East and North African lives in the city. And this is the work and the process, the creative process that Wael followed to come up with that font. And these are the names of cities of origin in the Middle East and neighborhoods in New York that you see also in the hanging from the ceiling, which gives a sense of a topography of Middle East and New York. So the exhibition unfolds across 4 sections: Roads to New York, A Life in the City, Impressions, and In Our Own Skin. And I'll walk you briefly through each one. So, Roads to New York, the section sets the stage for the early immigration of Middle East and North African communities to the city. And this movement is quite vividly captured in photographs that we have in our holdings, taken at Ellis Island between 1892, 1925, and actually even 1930s by Augustus Sherman and Lewis Hine. I was very worried about the use of these images because I find them very ethnographic in nature and often staged, especially for the men on the right, Algerian men. But they offered me an opportunity to reflect on the lives of ordinary individuals whose names actually were left anonymous, were rarely recorded. And I talk about that specifically in the labels. And the largest and most prominent group among these early arrivals were Syrians, meaning the people who came from Ottoman Greater Syria, present-day Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, Israel. And between 1880 and 1930, we know that more than 100,000 people from the Levant, from the region, migrated to the United States. With New York as the primary entry point. And many settled in the Syrian colony or Little Syria on Washington Street in Lower Manhattan, which became a vibrant commercial and cultural hub. And actually, the man on the right, who never made it into the US, he was denied entry at Ellis Island because he failed at answering the question about polygamy. He came from Algeria. He was on his way to Little Syria, where he was promised a job on Washington Street. And then once in New York, I can come back to this later. This is a contemporary interpretation of Algerian Men by Ai Weiwei. Once in New York, newcomers created tools to help each other navigate life in a new country. One example is the earliest phrase book published by Abraham Youssef Erbili. On the left, we have the first edition from 1896. And this copy is quite moving because Abraham Youssef Erbili autographed it himself to Andrew Carnegie in 1901. And I really like this page because it includes, among many other things in many chapters, it includes a beautiful conjugation of love, if you pay attention to what is translated and transliterated into Arabic on those pages. But alongside language guides, manuals, immigrants also produced citizenship manuals with sample naturalization interview questions, documents that reveal both the bureaucratic hurdles and the prejudices people encountered, as in the case of Mohammed Juda, that Algerian man that I just mentioned, whose immigration was denied. And you see the question on the left page of the manual to the right: are you a polygamist or do you believe in polygamy? That same question that barred Mohammed Juda and other Muslims from entering the US. And so these early materials help us see migration not only as a mass movement, but as lived experience of learning a new language, navigating, American bureaucracy, figuring out city life, and building networks of support. And there are many other works in this section that, like pamphlets or guides published by the Syrian Educational Society in New York or the Syrian Ladies Aid Society that I can talk about later. The second section is about how the community and life in New York took root through publishing and through businesses and also performing arts. So a key part of the community's development was the rise of the Arabic language press. In New York, and by 1900, newspapers printed in Arabic were circulating already across the US, serving as news sources, as cultural platforms for debate, and community lifelines. And one of the most influential was El Huda, founded in 1898 by Naum Mukarzel, and his brother Salum Mukarzel revolutionized Arabic publishing in 1910, I believe, by patenting the first Arabic linotype machine in New York. And we see the advertisement here in some of the periodicals published then, which is an innovation that made Arabic printing faster and more accessible. I'm gonna jump to music and performing arts in the city, which was a big focus in this section because I'm biased. I really love that part of the history of Middle Eastern life in New York. Also because I discovered all these treasures at the Library for the Performing Arts, which is one of the research center of NYPL, which holds catalogs of music records, audio recordings produced and recorded by the earliest Armenian, Syrian, and Lebanese communities in musicians in New York. And most of these materials were actually still not cataloged, and it took some time to find them in our holdings. And I really wanted to showcase them here and to show that Middle Eastern life in the city took had many aspects, including music and performing arts. This section also moves, beyond the printed word in different ways to explore cultural and social life more broadly. So New York stages and nightclubs became home to artists such as a Syrian opera singer Elvira Hilal, Ibrahim Farah, who is to the figure on the right, who is a pioneering dancer and choreographer who introduced Middle Eastern dance traditions to American audiences, and whose full archive live at the Library for the Performing Arts. And what is interesting is that within his archive, Ibrahim Farah, during his lifetime, he actually archived papers of other artists and performers who he collaborated with. So within his archive, there are already, other layers of archives, such as Eddie Kochak's archives, which are within Ibrahim Farah's archives. And Eddie Kochak was a Syrian Armenian percussionist and entertainer who helped popularize Debke in the US and wrote music scores for American films. And he lived on Atlantic Avenue. So if you walk around Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, everyone would know who Eddie Kochak is. And here you see Dikochek on the right in these nightclubs, including the one and then a nightclub on the left, which was founded and owned by two Egyptian sisters who hosted these very Orientalist and exotic shows, but also hosted jazz shows like Ahmed Jamal, the famous American pianist, who performed there as well. The third section, impressions, foregrounds Middle Eastern, North African voices reflecting on New York itself. Often exhibitions, I mean, things really change, but this is also the second exhibition ever dedicated to Middle Eastern immigration to New York in New York. But usually exhibitions about immigrant communities focus on how they were represented by others. Here, I wanted to reverse that dynamic and center their own words and perspectives. So this section begins with the first edition of Mikhail Asad Rustam's Kitab al-Gharib fi al-Gharb, A Stranger in the West, published in 1895 in New York. And this is one of the earliest known accounts of an Arab traveler describing life in the United States, with a chapter on New York. This section also features writers from the Rabita al-Qalamiyya, the Pen League, the literary society founded in 1920 by Syrian writers, including Khalil Gibran. Many people were questioning why Khalil Gibran wasn't very, visible in this section. I thought he receives also always too much attention, so I thought let's focus on other lesser-known writers like Nicola al-Haddad, at least lesser known to the public. And also Gibran is featured through his artwork and the covers he made for his for the other members of Rabita. So if many Mahjari writers either embraced or spoke and wrote about their new home, I wanted to complicate this narrative by highlighting those who reacted more critically to New York. And one striking example is Nicola al-Haddad's 1908 essay, A Painful Sight in New York. I think it's the second part is A Disgrace to the Modern City, and he's talking about New York. And here he describes the poverty, hunger, and homelessness he encountered during that year, the economic recession of that year. And his reflections really culminates in a searing indictment of economic inequality in the United States. A lot of things that we could still think of today when we think of New York and the US. And so his work reminds us that immigrant narratives are not uniformly celebratory. They include disappointment, critique, and moral urgency. To bring these writings to life, the exhibition includes, specifically in this section, audio recordings in Arabic, allowing visitors to hear the rhythm and sonority of these texts read by contemporary poets and writers who either live in the city or spend some time in the city, like Iman Mersal, who was last year a Kalman Fellow at NYPL, Yasmin Sil, Omar Barrada, and so on. Other more critical and sarcastic descriptions of New York 80, رواية by Yusuf Idris, and then أمريكا الضاحكة. And this one is a Egyptian student who spent some time in the US. And then the section concludes with two works by contemporary artist Rea Karam, whose geometric photographic interventions across New York highlight the invisible boundaries and thresholds of urban space. And so her work really bridges historical perspectives with contemporary reflections on her journey to belong and trying to belong to the city. The last section, in our own skin, explores themes of race, representation, and celebrates those who have reclaimed their narratives and amplified MENA voices in the face of scrutiny, affirming here the power of art, scholarship, but also activism to shape new possibilities of self-representation. So the section takes its title from we see it here, sorry, to the right, a film from a film titled In My Own Skin, The Complexity of Living as an Arab in America, a documentary filmed by Jennifer Jage, Palestinian-American filmmaker, artist, in October 2001, just a few weeks after September 11. And she has here interviewed 5 young Arab women in New York, in which really she captured the tension, the rawness, and the resilience of that moment. And so including this work also helped me address a gap in NYPL's collections, the lack of documentation of post 9/11 Arab and Muslim experiences in the city. And that was a struggle, trying to talk about that very defining moment without much materials. Another piece in this section is a zine produced by Malika, a feminist grassroots collective in Astoria that focuses on self-defense, financial literacy, and community safety for hijabi women. And it really grew, and it offers all these support for women from any background. Their work emerged against the backdrop of gentrification and increased policing, and it illustrates how communities build institutions of care and support in response to structural pressures. And this zine was made in collaboration with MoMA PS1 when Malika was invited to create an exhibition on their work in Astoria. And so they were invited to do this zine this exhibition, at MoMA PS1. Other surprising holdings in the collections that I wasn't able to find anywhere else in any other institutions are these yearbooks produced by the Organization of Arab Students in the USA, which was founded in Michigan in 1952, but headquartered in New York City. And they were meant to really provide support to Arab students who came to the US, and then things really shifted after the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, when Palestine and more and other movements of liberation, like the Algerian fight for independence, really became at the center of their struggle, and they organized tours for delegations from Palestine and from Algeria, for instance, across the United States. So really, these materials challenge assumptions of insularity and instead reveal networks of solidarity and political imagination that really place New York at this on a more global and international network of solidarity. How much time do I have, Roxana?
We need to slowly wrap it up.
Great. Well, maybe I won't talk about some of the artists who are in this section, and we can talk about them later. But maybe I'll conclude with Bodega Boys, which is a photographic series by Iranian photographer Mahka Islami, who was herself an Iranian immigrant who had to leave the U.S. because of the Muslim ban a few months ago. But when she came to New York, she struggled to find inspiration in the city. She couldn't familiarize herself with the city until she went to a bodega, another bodega owned by Yemeni sometimes Yemeni families or people, and she built this relationship with Yemeni bodega owners, and that's how she started working on this series called Bodega Boys. And she spoke a lot with them, she interviewed them, she conducted a sort of oral history where they shared about the strike they conducted in 2017 following the first Muslim ban, to show how essential their work is in Brooklyn, especially in areas that are considered as food desert. And also doing so, they familiarized other New Yorkers and Brooklynites about the background of these people who they had no idea or never really got to know the lives and the experiences of these people. So I'll maybe conclude here, and we can talk more later.
Thank you very much, Hiba. Akram, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's truly and honestly a privilege to be in the company of both Elizabeth and Hiba, both of whom are really forces of nature in the work they do, and they really have been transformative in their labor. And I'm just going to speak for a few minutes. I mean, for those of you, as Roxana introduced me, I direct the Khayrallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies, although I always joke we use the term Lebanese in a fairly imperial sense. We actually talk about Arab more than Lebanese. And I can talk about the politics of archives and donations relating to the name. And so we do a lot of similar work. We collaborate extensively with them. But my job today isn't talk about that so much as to kind of pull together some of the themes that came up. We'll continue with the conversations in Q&A that some of you have already contributed to, and then to pose some questions for all of us to think about. I mean, what is really very interesting is that we're talking about, in some ways, very distinct types of geographies, archival geographies. So on one hand, Hiba is very much focused on New York City, although in many ways, New York City as a node for transnational lives across time and space, while Elizabeth and the Arab American National Museum are really focused on more the United States as a country, even though they're located in Dearborn, and the lives of Arab Americans across. And just kind of add to the mix a little bit, with the Khayrallah Center, we're actually focused on much larger geographies, even if it's a smaller group of people. So in many ways, what we're seeing here is archives that are going at the different levels of scale. But what's interesting is all of us are dealing with the same questions. And I think the common themes that both Elizabeth and Hiba, and to a certain extent, a lot of the stuff we do, is how do we change the ways in which Arab Americans are viewed, how we transform the narratives. So obviously there's a politics to a lot of our work, obviously, which is how do we come about, I mean, there's 9/11 as a backdrop, but it's really not the only moment in which Arab Americans have been maligned or completely elided, which is more important. And just look at any history of America from, high school to college, we don't exist. There is no existence for us, except, of course, when they bring in as a quintessential terrorists. So the work that Hiba and Elizabeth and we are doing as well is how do we transform that narrative? And I think what's really remarkable in their work is that they are doing something that hadn't been done before. Because a lot of the material, and I love what Hiba mentioned about these material that have been hidden or not seen, right? We were doing a project, by the way, on Arab American labor. It's online. And we went to the largest archive of Arab American labor history. There is no mention of Arab Americans working, period. We had to go to the Arab American National Museum and their amazing collection of interviews as one of the things that we collected. So there is a lot of that's hidden that has to, in essence, you have to engage in an archaeological expedition to bring it up to the top. At the same time, that again, what Elizabeth was talking about and what we're talking about is you collect new material. And Hiba was alluding to that when she talked about post 9/11 and the stories that are not being told. So in many ways, these archives have a very challenging thing that is not, other archives may not necessarily have it. I'm not proclaiming that as a generalization, but certainly, more established archives aren't having to deal with the back and the front. What I mean by that is unearthing what had been hidden, but also collecting material and a large span across geography. And I think both of them obviously are doing them in different ways to a certain extent, although a lot of commonalities. And at the center of these efforts is the community. And I think that, within the archival communities, they call it Archive 2.0, in which we are actually bringing the community into conversation with the collection. So, we are no longer, well, we try not to anyway, our best effort, we're not trying to dictate what will be collected as much as have a conversation about what should be collected. But the other element of tension, which I think is very generative, is about between memory and history. Because the community has memories and has stories, and I think in many ways, I can tell you a funny story about that one time later maybe, but it just is, who's writing the grand narrative, as Hiba alluded to, and where are the stories of quote unquote regular people, and how do these things exist in a generative tension? And I think both organizations have done a beautiful job. Hiba through this exhibit, obviously Elizabeth with the Arab American National Museum throughout their history, that has created that kind of productive conversation and tensions. And I think that in many ways is very important. But I think there's another level that we should be thinking about. And again, I can talk about that here because we think about that a lot, is in many ways, archives traditionally had been this 19th century structure, physical structure. You put things in them, and then they all of a sudden become accessible only to a few people who can access them in terms of scholarly background, in terms of knowledge of how you manage an archive. But I think the biggest challenge for us, after, the next step for me, or an ongoing step really, is how do we make our material accessible to the community? So exhibits are great. I think that's fantastic, and we engage with that. Documentaries, exhibits, outreach. All of that stuff is amazing. And I know that Elizabeth and Hiba both do a lot of outreach work. But at the same time, how do we make sure that this material that we're collecting is not just sitting there only for a few scholars to use? Because it really does belong to the community. And I think that's a big question. It cannot be answered easily, but it's something that we should be thinking about. And then, of course, when we engage the community in conversation, the challenge for us is to navigate between the bureaucracies that we all exist in and their own politics and limitations. I mean, in the end, listen, I mean, archives are also about limitations, resources, space, money, time. We all need to have a life every now and then. So it's between that and what the community thinks is important and what does not think it's important. And I think that for all of us is a really major concern. And the third one for me also, I mean, I think about this a lot, is how do we go scales? As I talked about, Hiba is talking about New York City primarily, Elizabeth is the United States. We function, at least at this point, in the Americas and in West Africa. But how do we manage the story across scale, right? I mean, how do we tell these stories of these transnational lives without, we anchor them because they were anchored sometimes in space and time, but at the same time, they really had transnational existences, right? You can imagine a moment in which somebody's making ahwe, a little, coffee, and you can imagine that smell that all of a sudden takes them out of that into where they came from. So all of us experience that in one way or the other, and I think that is a big challenge for archives. How do you create that simultaneity of the here and now, and then really a transnational life, whether through what we read, who we communicate with, how we travel, and just simply how we exist. And I think that is a very big question for all of us, really combined, in terms of the geographies, if you will. And I think, the other element here is that what I'm kind of thinking about, and I will conclude with that, is that how do we allow people to write their own narratives, right? I mean, how do we become conduits for conversations? And I love what Elizabeth said about collaborations. And I think what is really important to understand is no single institution can, but more importantly should, house everything. I mean, that approach to 19th century archiving is ridiculous. It's problematic at so many different levels. It's untenable. And I love what Elizabeth said, that even digital space has limitation. And by the way, also digital material degrades. And so we have to be very concerned about it. And my big concern now is how do we archive in the 21st century when Facebook and Instagram own much of the material? But that's a different conversation. But so in many ways then, I think creating networks is so vital. We are collaborating, as I said. I mean, I've worked a lot with Hiba. I've worked a little bit with Elizabeth, but with the Arab American National Museum, we've worked a lot. But also we're extending it to a larger geography. And my model for that is this wonderful book, A Country of Words by Abu Rifa, that is just a fantastic book. It's out of the Stanford University Press. It's digital born. It's made digital. And basically she looks at Palestinian writers all across the world and how they move. And when you look at the dynamic aspect of it, in many ways, it's that kind of network about how information moves. In many ways, I think the archive that I imagine, it has to be that kind of dynamism, that kind of connectivity in which we flow across national boundaries, which are in many ways artificial, obviously. And so I think those are the challenges that we face. But at the same time, I want to conclude with something that, I mean, Elizabeth and Hiba were rushing through their 15 minutes, but I've been in both institutions. I owe much of my career to New York Public Library and the ability that they housed Al-Huda, for example, and I cherish the work. I mean, these are institutions that are so amazing to me. They are always a model of how we should be. And I wasn't kidding when I said earlier, before I think we started, they are in many ways my North Stars. I look to them for inspiration, for guidance, and obviously for conversation and commiseration. We can talk about the commiseration later. Anyway, I will conclude with that. There's a lot more to talk about, but I really want to open it up to our very good colleagues who are waiting to.
Thank you very much, Akram. So before we open it, I want to offer the opportunity to Hiba and Elizabeth, if you would like to respond to some of the questions that Akram has posed. And if some of the ideas or the questions that he has posed has inspired you in some way.
I can begin. Thank you so much, Akram. It's always such a treat to hear you talk and to share with you about all these aspects of our work. You were talking about collaboration, Elizabeth, as well. That's something that I'm hoping for the future. Not only collaborating in the US with other American institutions, but in with Middle Eastern institutions to give a sense of these transnational conversations, transnational lives and experiences. And so just to give us a sense of, we were talking about this, Roxana, during previous meetings as we were preparing for this talk about the nature of diasporic life, that it's not constrained, it's not limited to one place, one moment, but it moves. These lives move, and it is very, very important to be able to collaborate and to support Middle Eastern institutions as well, as much as they support us with their collections. And so, yeah, I was also thinking about how to make how to unlock these collections and all the limitations pertaining to, the definition of archives, but also, as Elizabeth was talking about earlier, even digital collections have their own limitations. And I constantly think about this. Sometimes it's really lies in I struggle to explain that the New York Public Library is a public institution, and everyone is welcome to come and to go to special divisions and look at rare materials and study them and use them. And I'm trying to think myself of how can we unlock and how can we make these collections even more accessible and used by the communities beyond, the use that we all know and that we're most exposed to, which is the scholarly use. So maybe I'll find more inspiration in what the Arab American National Museum does and the practices in Dearborn.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am immensely flattered that you've taken inspiration from my talk. Yeah, I think collaborations in particular is something that we are constantly thinking of and thinking outside of the box on. We were established by basically a group of social activists. So we come from that lens kind of always in terms of outreach and justice for the community. And I think we sort of maintain that philosophy as we continue to grow and collect from the community and work with the community and always keep them as part of the conversation and always keep them in mind. Yeah, I think I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so one thing we talked about a lot of collaborations. I think for us, we're kind of in this new era of getting our materials into mainstream venues. So not just through exhibitions. We have been doing a lot of loans in the last couple of years of materials, but also through publications. I think not just scholars, but getting, I think Akram mentioned public schools like into the curriculum and things like that. That's something that, people are recognizing the Arab American community as a force to be reckoned with, and being part of that conversation, being a resource for these scholars, for school boards and things like that, is something that we're hoping to continue to do. Yeah.
May I also add something, and that's probably a question that I'm sharing with way too many people here, which what I also appreciate about the Arab American National Museum is that it feels like it is an institution that is very embedded in the community and grounded in the community. Whereas I feel like my work at the New York Public Library it consists of in building a relationship of trust and trust with the community and putting the institution on the map to tell the communities that I work with that this is a place where you can conduct research, but it's also a place where you can be represented through your personal archive or papers or artwork and so on. But also there are collections that speak to your own experience. And that is not always something that people are aware of. The exhibition is helping a lot. Public programs as well. I think, yeah, I forgot to mention that. We, so far, all of our public programs were packed. We are, I think, one of the most important or highlight of our public program is a building takeover, a MENA takeover of our building on December 5th, and it got sold out in 2 days. And so we gave away and sold 2,000 tickets, and it says a lot about maybe the need and that people really want to see themselves seen. They want to be seen and feel seen in these institutions, and they want to celebrate their stories in places like NYPL, which hasn't really been on that map or as a reference where those collections live and are represented. But anyway, I'm all of this to say that it's something that I'm thinking a lot about how to make NYPL, to place it there on the map.
Thank Akram, you want to
I
say
just
something?
want to jump in with a couple of things to follow up on what Hiba was saying. And this is, I mean, I have to draw from our own experience. So when we first started the center, the first project we did was to do a documentary called, perhaps very kitsch, Cedars and the Pines. Cedars, of course, because it's a Lebanese tree, and pines because it's the pine in North Carolina. It's the history of Lebanese Palestinian Syrian community in North Carolina from the 1880s onwards. And the documentary was an hour long. It was shown on PBS, but the premiere was at the North Carolina Museum of History, and in very typical, perhaps, Lebanese fashions, the fire marshal was very pissed off because we had a lot more people than we were allowed. There were 350 seats and we had 500 people. So, and at the end, a good number of people were crying. Not because the documentary was brilliant. The documentary was good. I don't claim, I mean, it was fine. It was fine. It was telling stories. But they were crying because for the first time, and this is back to Hiba's point and what Elizabeth's work is all about and the Arab American National Museum, for the first time, their stories that they have been telling each other around kitchen tables and in hafle and maybe in mahrajan is all of a sudden being placed on a big screen at the North Carolina Museum of History. It's embedded. And I think there's a powerful aspect to that moment to me. In many ways, that's what launched the center for here, that allows them to, because they were the ones who told us the story, and then they're seeing it reflected on the big screen, to tell these stories and then see that they have a place there for where before they just had to hide away from it for one reason or another, or simply that nobody even bothered to ask about it. So, I mean, I think that kind of exposure, that what you talked about, Hiba, with 2000, and I know that many events, some of which we collaborated with the Arab American National Museum, where you have tons of people arriving. I mean, that's just such an incredibly powerful moment for us. And I think, for me, one of the things that allows us to magnify those moments is technology. I mean, quite frankly, and we're obviously working on very different technologies these days, but technology becomes an incredibly important element in that. So, when Hiba was showing that screenshot of the linotype machine, I mean, I think you cannot underestimate in any way, form, or shape how transformative that was in creating, not only in the United States, but in South America and Central America, massive number of publications and newspapers that actually created a sense of community, right? I mean, if you think of Benedict Anderson and the idea of creating an imagined community. So these technologies, that people use them in all sorts of ways. And recently we have somebody who gave us a collection of cassette tapes, right? That they had been recording back and forth to Lebanon. I mean, that kind of technology, I think for us, it becomes also very vital as we move forward, now with AI and all that. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about that kind of powerful moment, if you will.
This is wonderful. And I'm just going to bring in some of the questions that our participants have asked. I'm sorry in advance if I'm going to butcher names, okay? So from Enrique Seward Limon, we have a question for Elizabeth. With a broad collection composed of personal and individualized minutiae, such as silverware, how does the Arab American National Museum plan to confront the necessity of deaccessioning beloved objects once collection becomes too big? He's asking as an archivist turned historian about the future of historical objects.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's something that we hope we never have to confront, but potentially it might be. um, I think that's something that we constantly, we are continuously collecting institutions. So it's something that we're continuously asking ourselves is if we have the physical capacity, the expertise to handle the material that we collect. So something, you know, we have a set of guidelines for us in our deaccessioning, but it is, you know, potentially many decades from now, we'll get to that point where we need to make really hard decisions. For us, it's, you know, preserving stories, I think, is first and foremost, rather maybe more so than physical material. So how do we go about preserving those stories, I think is more the question. And I think our collection scope is going to continuously get narrower and narrower as we, you know, progress in years. And that's something that we'll just have to reckon with. And, you know, as I said before, it's always with the community in mind and in communication. So it's, you know, who knows where we will necessarily go with the collecting scope, but it's, you know, something that we'll continuously explore and kind of refine our definitions for what we're collecting.
So now I'm going to combine two questions. One is from Shireen Saad and another one is from Saima Akhtar, who has done doctoral research at the Arab American National Museum, which is wonderful because we keep coming to this notion of how can, you know, museums and archives and public institutions be centers of research and in themselves produce knowledge. So I'm going to combine two questions. One from Shireen, what are some tactics that move archive from representation to resistance? And to add to this question, how do you complicate Orientalism and self-Orientalism in these types of early collections? Since those of means of power, since those of means and in power often dictate what is preserved and collected. This is a question for all of you.
This reminds me again of takes me back to the conversations we had in the past, in the past few weeks, Roxana, about the positionality of curators and librarians in these institutions and how they define collecting areas and what are the priorities for them. And so, you know, being aware of these priorities, that's how the decisions we make, that's how it will, you know, shift archives from representation to resistance. And also what it means, even the political nature of a curator or a librarian from a diverse background in these institutions, and really balance, you know, institutional priorities and community's expectations, and also what is needed today to counterbalance those Orientalist and early materials collected in the early 20th century. And this is why, yes, my priority these past, of course, continue to expand collections to fill gaps from the early 20th century, but also gaps in a more recent history. Again, post 9/11, Muslim experience in war and terror in New York, or you know, the student protests from the past 2 years, which is something that I'm also very aware of and sensitive to. So this is how I think we can envision the work today and build on, you know, we can't ignore what was done in the past or just say, no, we can't have this anymore. We can't work with this. And I think also the exhibition, I had to work with those materials and very Orientalist or self-orientalizing materials, but I tried to give a more critical perspective and understanding of these materials in the labels. So we can play with those. We can't, it's just not a matter of, it's not a matter of, no, let's just forget about these. Let's work with them also to understand what the perception today is built upon, right?
If I may jump in, so I mean that's one of the issues that literally sometimes I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, what are we missing in terms of the collection? I mean, I think every archivist who is socially conscious and my colleagues here are amazing examples of that, is always thinking about that power. You're absolutely right. That question is about, because the people who have money and privileges can preserve material and then hand it to us. And in many ways, they are the ones who are going to tip the scales. But we ask questions like, one of the things that we have initiated is the kind of focusing on the queer community, because we have not been able to see a whole lot of voices within our archive of the Lebanese immigrants. And I think that was kind of a self-conscious effort. I'm not saying it always will work. I'm not saying it's a permanent solution or even the best solution. So, one thing, we always have to be humble and realize that we will all screw up. And we're not omniscient or omnipotent, and certainly we're not, Elon Musk with $1 trillion package. I don't know how a human being gets that, but that's a different story. But so we're always asking these questions, and I think these conversations that we're having today, but conversations that we always have together, keeps us alert to that possibility. But I think the next stage for me as well, and I go back here to technology, not because I have a technology fetish or because I have an undergraduate degree in computer engineering, or perhaps it is because of that. But I think for me, it's also how do we decenter institutional archives? In other words, how do we help? Because this is happening already on Facebook, in which you have family archives and community archives developing. A most famous example of that is the camps in Sabra and Shatila in Beirut. That there's just been some amazing work by the community itself. So, but the technological issues here involved in creating decentered archives that allows people of very limited means, financially and technologically, to archive themselves and to determine what they are gonna, to basically make that, in some ways, cut the middle person out. I don't mean to get myself out of a job, but I think, again, I go back to Elizabeth's point. The next stage here is to kind of not so much talk about what's coming in, it's what we can do to help out. And I think there are many, initiatives happening, by the way, at that level, and I think they're very exciting, even as there are many hurdles to go. But I think that those are the two areas where I see ways in which we can counter the previous model, if you will.
Yeah, I'll just jump in very quickly with, about contextualizing the self-orientalism. And Akram kind of alluded a little bit to, we are messy as archives. Our community is also messy. And I think the more that we can contextualize that and sort of embrace that, it's a service to us to be able to educate folks about like the context from which our communities were operating under through different time periods. So for us, we can use self-orientalism imagery to educate about stereotypes today and, draw those connections from past to present. But yeah, we'll see.
If I may just intervene for a second for the simple fact that I'm familiar with these institutions, one way of resistance is also the museum and the archive becoming in themselves agents of producing archive. So for example, in the case of Hiba New York exhibition, the fact that you have the archival silence on post 9/11 and you tackle that archival silence by making it as a voice through the Yemeni bodegas, that is a form of resistance of archival silences. In the case of Elizabeth at the Arab National Museum, there is a collection that I'm very fond of, which is an archive that the museum has created, which is an oral archive of workers in the Ford plant. People like anthropologists interviewing Arab Americans working in the Ford plant, like everyday lives and backgrounds and biographies. And now that archive exists there as a form of resistance against the silences of Arab Americans in the Ford company. So these institutions can also in themselves become active agents of producing archives, not just preserving. And another question comes from here, Brandon Waldau, who's has been doing research at Columbia, and this is mostly for Hiba. I was wondering if in your research for this exhibition, other Arabic language publications emerged as having similar connections to the linotype machine and new methods of mechanized typesetting around New York City, like Al-Huda. Did movable type still have a role after the emergence of the linotype within these early printing circles in New York City?
Thank you for your question, Brandon. It took me some time to understand the technical aspects of linotype machine, so I won't be able to, I know that the linotype machine made publishing much faster, and it's really fostered an explosion of newspapers and publishing in New York, and had an impact on the Middle East, I think, Akram, right? I mean, and it shows how New York was central to that and instrumental. But yeah, I mean, what I was saying is that the founder of Al Huda and Al Huda Press developed this technological innovation that then had an impact on that allowed for other presses and other periodicals to be and works to be published. But I don't know how other Arabic language publications emerge as having similar connections to the linotype machine. Yes, that the linotype machine allowed for other publications to be published in New York, in the United States. I think also in the Mahjar in South America, and then in the Middle East.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, the difference is the earlier typesetting, you had wooden blocks with letters that you manually had to put in a certain line. The linotype machine was a keyboard with sometimes 90 characters, sometimes more for Arabic, in which you type and it does the typesetting for you. So you can imagine the much faster process. And with Arabic, obviously, the complication was that each letter could take on different forms depending on its positionality. But yeah, I mean, absolutely the case. In Brazil, it took a while. We don't see in Brazil linotype machines emerging till somewhere around the late 1920s, early 1930s. So it took them a while. But actually, what's very interesting is the linotype machine, as Hiba was saying, made a much quicker entry into the Middle East itself, in which you began to see in Egypt, Al Ahram, which is one of the biggest presses there, was really kind of immediately kind of invested in that kind of technology. And so it's really quite remarkable. And that goes back again to the issue that we talked about earlier, is these geographies and transnational lives. As much as, like Hiba was focusing on with the music that was being performed in New York City, also you had performers imported, whether from North Africa or from Egypt. Egyptian films, Egyptian music, Egyptian performers were very common. They went on the circuit. And so there's this constant back and forth that I think is just amazingly fascinating to me in that regard.
Yeah, I couldn't show a photograph that we have from 1936 of in the catalog. It's titled a Lebanon restaurant because it really shows a Lebanese restaurant on Washington Street. But next to it, we noticed with Linda Jacobs that there was actually a music store, I mean a record store with advertisement on Kulthum and Mohammed Abdel Wahab, which were these big Egyptian celebrities that everyone listened to in the Middle East. And it really shows again how the communities here were very much, aware and listened to the music produced back home. So, yeah.
I just want to jump in real quick. We actually have a former staff member who is like really into linotype and letterpress and has done like master's level research on the Arabic linotype. So if Brandon wants to reach out to us, we can hopefully get you connected to our former staff member.
Wonderful. And also a final question. What are your thoughts on digitizing and open source collections, which can be beneficial to researchers and the public, but can also lead to a host of issues around open access, metadata tagging, and the politics of search in databases? And this is a question also from Saima.
I think from our perspective, we are operating under, more is more. The more we can connect and give access to the collections that we hold, the easier it is for researchers and curators to be able to do the work that they want to do into the collections. And sometimes it's just a starting point, and then it leads to a much larger conversation in terms of scholarship and creating connections through different archives. And we obviously are human and are prone to error. So it's a constant process that we're trying to improve. So I know Akram has, some grand ideas and hopes for digital collections that we are very much in support of. Yeah, for us, more is more.
I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, because it kind of answers a little bit. So, I mean, I think if you think about archives, we used to have these, card catalogs, indexes. We're moving to metadata for the digital, either digital born or digitized material. And I think the next stage for the way I kind of think about it, this is what Elizabeth was alluding to, is full text search, in which you don't have a mediation of an archivist who's saying, I think this is about this. So I'm just going to share, if it's okay, just for a second. This is a new project. You guys are the first to see this. So you will see this is part of our Arabic manuscripts. It's handwritten Arabic. So we've been using AI project for this. And one of the things we wanted to do, because we found that a lot of people don't have Arabic skills, even though they are descendants of Arabic speaking peoples. But they, so in essence, we don't even ask you to write in Arabic anymore. So I can type the word museum, as you can see, and then I can search for it. This is not a metadata. So, and then you open it up and you've got the word mathaf in Arabic. You've got this text that appears to it, and you translate it into English, right? So in essence, or you can translate it if you wanted to French, if you prefer that. This is not perfect by any means. We know the holes, not least of which is we are developing a lexicon of late 19th century, early 20th century Arabic that's very different than now. Levantine Arabic is very different than North African Arabic, different than Gulf Arabic. So we recognize all the limitations. But for us, I mean, we are, again, I know I'm beginning to really sound like I worship at the altar of technology, but I think for me, this is such a powerful tool, because the next stage for us is to allow community members to upload. Let's say somebody's sitting in Oklahoma City and their great grandmother left them a collection of letters that they cannot access. They can upload them through a portal and choose whether to leave them in a database or not, but then they can get translations. And in that sense, my point here is that we are no longer limited by just specific metadata. Although I have to echo Elizabeth, that we do the best we can and we will screw up along the way. Again, we're human. But I think the other thing for me about this is it helps to break not the control, but the advantage that the global North has over the global South in knowledge production. Because now somebody sitting in Cairo does not have to travel to anywhere here to look at an archive and incur all the costs involved, and therefore limit their ability to write a story. Because we are privileged in American university and American institutions that somebody will give us a chunk of money to go travel to archives. And I love that. I think there's something to be said about sitting in an archive, that the digital world takes it away, and I recognize that issue. But at the same time, I think this is a very powerful tool that allows us to open up access as much as we can and invite people to critique us, right? I mean, to say, hey, you're missing something, right? I mean, I had somebody do that to me. He said, you're missing something. And I said, what are we missing? And they said this. And I said, okay, can you give it to us? And so we added it. So it becomes a conversation opener as well as we develop this technology. And we do the same thing, or we've done the same thing for newspapers already. And our collaboration with Hiba and the New York Public Library has been very much centered. Like Jurab al-Kurdi, which was an image that you put up, we worked with them to digitize, and it's available, completely searchable and translatable now. So this is the kind of stuff that I think allows us to get beyond some certain limitations. It doesn't mean that we won't have new problems that emerge from this. I recognize that.
This is wonderful. Akram, I think you will be a panelist for a future webinar. And just a final question. This question comes from me, and I'm wondering, because we talked about the importance of working with communities and creating narratives about communities. I also want to ask you, what do you think are the challenges of actually building archives with communities rather than about them? And here it also ties to the fact that our panelists come from institutions, like one is public, one is private, but you also have the institutional dimension. So if you can just tell us a bit about some of the challenges that you saw in building archives with communities, not only with diaspora communities, but maybe also communities in the Middle East.
I mean, yeah, for sure. I think when the museum was first starting out, I think there were a lot of challenges connecting with a national scope of community members. We weren't established, necessarily at that time. So gaining that trust within a community, even today, we still sometimes struggle with depending on the donor, individual, or community. So that's something that we're constantly, trying to maintain and build. And then also setting expectations for what they want to see done with their materials. Sometimes they really want us to build giant exhibitions around things that we can't necessarily do. I think we mentioned, funding and capacity and size earlier. Those are all factors to challenges that we face. Yeah, I think it's always a learning experience. Each donation is, case by case basis, and it helps us to navigate the field in terms of museums fields, in terms of Arab American study fields, and in terms of care within our collections and the collecting methodology that we practice. So they keep us on our toes, and also, form really great relationships too. It helps us to develop the material in the future, and go into new locations and ideas that we might not have had before.
We probably all share the same limitations or issues. So I'm just gonna echo what Elizabeth said. So, but for me, maybe again, building trust with the communities and thinking of the New Republic Library as a partner, as an ally, where these collections can live in perpetuity and be preserved in perpetuity, and potentially at some point even digitized. So that trust, first of all, and yes, just as Elizabeth said, it's managing expectations, and that takes a lot of time, a lot of back and forth, and the fear, obviously, that in the meantime the collections can get damaged or and not be in a state that they could still be preserved, so yeah. But other than that, honestly, I think since I joined the New Republic Library, I've been really supported, and my either my expertise or my decisions have always been supported, because it's almost a new area to build at the New Republic Library. Even though there was an Oriental division, then Asian Middle Eastern division, this is the first position, an area that is specifically dedicated to the Middle Eastern Islamic and diasporic collections. So there's a whole, field to build, and there's a lot of support and trust from the institution so far.
I'll jump in with a couple of things. First, I mean, again, echo everything that was said. People bring you a collection and they're proud of it, naturally. They're excited about it. It's their family or friends or whatever, and they wanted to have, the lion's share of whatever they imagined the lion's share would be. But I think ultimately it's also for us, and this is something that we have been doing a lot. We did it a couple of times with Matthew Stifler from the Arab American National Museum, which is to go out into the community itself, right? Nationally here. But also we are expanding a lot of our work into South America now, in which we go in and we do workshops, right? We talk about, in real terms about the limitations of archives, but also what they can do to keep, what we can help them with. So we have these community conversations, and I think Elizabeth is alluding to that. Obviously, Hiba is alluding to that as well. And in many ways, I find those to be incredibly productive, because they also teach me a lot more than I teach anybody else with this. And I learn, what are their frustrations, are their dreams, or, and it always helps us, have a conversation. But there are realities at the same time. I'll just tell you one really quick thing. We had a conference, because we run a lot of academic conferences at the center, called Locating Palestine in the Arab Americas, right? It was a big conference. We brought a lot of people from South and Central America, as well as North America. Diana Abu Ali, the director of Arab American National Museum, was there. And shortly thereafter, there was a campaign on Facebook by some guy who's clearly Lebanese, who called for my removal from my position because I'm talking about Arab and I'm not Lebanese at all. And how dare you? You're in a center that's called Lebanese, right? I mean, so that is a real I mean, for some people, he clearly was very offended, and this was not like a one-time thing. He wrote to my dean, wrote to the chancellor of the university. I mean, not that anything came of it, honestly, but still, that we will rub people the wrong way because sometimes we're talking about a very complex stories, right? Like for me, we're working on a project now about crime. I mean, because listen, some of these guys when they arrive, they were engaged in really kind of interesting work, and for me, that's an interesting story. When we talk about race, people were very upset because they thought you shouldn't be bringing such bad things up. I'm sure Hiba and Elizabeth have experienced the same thing. So it is when we begin to go away from some, this kind of, we came, we worked, we became wealthy, everything was great story that begins to kind of become a little bit more complex. But I think even that is very interesting because I learned a lot from it as well. Anyway, so it's always fun nonetheless.
Thank you very much to all of you for this wonderful conversation. And thank you to all the people who have joined us.